what you would think it would mean. These are people who, get their work done on time, show up to work on time, do what they're supposed to do what they say they're going to do. And then, people who are low on conscientiousness are people who would probably describe themselves as artistic and free spirits and can't be bothered with appointments and doing things on a timely manner and so forth. And agreeableness sounds is pretty much what it says. Agreeableness is people who be warm and friendly and tend to get along with other people. And if you're low on agreeableness, you're sort of mean and unfriendly and proud and not people. So now these are intended to be somewhere between loosely coupled and completely statistically independent. So I think, one of the things that's interesting to think about, for example, is extroversion and agreeableness are not the same factors. So you can have extroverted people who in fact are disagreeable. If you give it some thought, you probably have met some of those people. And you can have introverted people who are agreeable and every other possible combination. In principle, you can have people who are high on neuroticism and still open to experience and so forth. You get all possible combinations should happen. So, Don Ellen et al. In the paper for today, this is cross-sectional data by age, and then they are from a German study, the black dots, and the British national study, and the open, I guess I should say black squares, and the open diamond-shaped thing. And we're showing here generally not terribly uncommon patterns that from start about mid-teens, from about mid-teens to the 80s, that there's a fairly linear decline in extroversion, a somewhat less pronounced increase in agreeableness. They get this kind of interesting divergence in conscientiousness. I'll come back to that in a minute. Also, a difference between the two samples in neuroticism, the neuroticism increasing over ages in the German sample and decreasing in the British sample.
I know why.
Okay. Tell us why.
I think it's because those people were born at the end of World War II. And that's the Nazis, that post-Nazi, that guilt stuff.
I thought the same.
You thought the same thing, yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of an obvious difference.
I think that's, my mom is a German Jewish refugee. She left Nazi Germany in 1938. I'm very conscious. I've been to Germany, and I talk to people, and that tremendous post-war guilt that generation had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would eat into them over time. And the next generation, the younger, don't have it. The people in their 20s and 30s.
And the Reconstruction period wasn't really fun either.
Yeah,
Let's just go through all the bombings and stuff.
You went to the same thing.
And the British, on the other hand, was
it's totally
unified
different.
and fun and Shiva.
I had a question about that article. I didn't see that they tested for cognitive impairments. Did they? Or did they take people out based on?
I don't think they did. These were huge samples. So I don't think they had cognitive impairment data. Do you think there would make a huge difference in personality?
I think it might make a difference in personality, and if you're studying personality, then why not just address that as well?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Also, did they take people out based on did they give a depression scale or something like that? I didn't see.
Probably not separate, and that would be really tricky because if you taking out depression would really mess with neuroticism. They overlap so much that it would be really hard. It's a really interesting issue, and I've tried to sort out what people could possibly do about it. But they're so, even at the item level, these measures are often really intertwined. Yeah.
Don't people often do like state and trait measures and just look at like how do you feel right now, and then you can frame it as in how do you feel in general, and the in general will kind of give you the trait or more personality type.
Yeah, and how high do you think they correlate?
Well, I know that they're pretty high, like 0.42 or 0.45, but
Higher in most of our cases. It's hard to get a lot of, if you're asking people at the same time, I think it's hard to get separation
yeah.
between the two.
Well, and I would imagine that having trait neuroticism would predict major depressive episodes at some point in your life.
Yeah.
That
So that's different than like clinical depression, which is more long lasting. So I mean, you could be like neurotic and not be depressed, but you can be depressed and still possibly have like kind of
So if you were high on trait neuroticism, you'd probably be at higher risk for clinical depression. And you should get higher scores in state depression measures compared to other people, pretty much regardless of whether you're currently in a bad mood. Also, just when you look at the measures, they're often like way overlapping, right, in content, between the neuroticism or the depression parts of neuroticism measures. So even we've had a couple of dissertations where people have kind of tried to look at things like this in fairly large samples, and there's almost always like several items in the scales that you have to take out to get not have autocorrelation. If you've got essentially the same item in two different scales, the scales are going to correlate. Autocorrelation means you're correlating with yourself. You've got the same items, so you're inducing high correlations. And so, I mean, there are some ways of trying to do it, but I think you have to have like multiple measures of people over multiple time points, and then try to estimate the trait neuroticism. And you can try to get some estimates of like state depression and anxiety, but every article that gets published in that gets other people wanting to reanalyze the data or explain how many mistakes you made in doing that. So it's very overlapping kinds of concepts. Somebody else have a hand up about the neuroticism side? The whole German-British thing? And then with openness, you've got slightly different trajectories, but kind of generally something like stability out to midlife, and then some fairly steep decline from midlife on. This is where you probably expect to see a lot of influence of intelligence or cognitive impairment measures especially. It would be interesting to try to back out of this if we could. They also talk about conscientiousness as a potentially cultural difference, whereas here you've got, it's the Germans actually getting even more conscientious as they go into late life, and the British getting less. You start hanging out at the pub all the time. Yeah.
I was just reading a paper that was just associating neuroticism with all-cause mortality. So do you think that, that here, I mean, if neuroticism and conscientiousness, conscientiousness seems to be salutary, so it seems like if you're more conscientious, you live longer, but if you're neurotic, that there's increased mortality risk associated with that. So then if people are kind of dying off at the end, in cross-sectional data, that you're kind of losing.
So you could be getting decreases in neuroticism because people who have neuroticism wouldn't live that long.
Right.
Yeah, it does tend to relate to all-cause. The data you were looking at actually show a relationship between conscientiousness and survival?
Yeah, I think it's been relatively recent, like 2008, 2009, that conscientiousness and neuroticism